Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly videos right here on my YouTube channel, and this video is part 3 of the La Family Quilt Along that we're doing, and we are finally going to start piecing 10 of our blocks. So we will be working on half of the blocks for our quilt along today. Let's get to it. Now, quick recap of the dark fabrics. You should have 20 squares that measure 4.5 by 4.5, and then of the lighter one here, we should have 50. So have your stack side by side here, and the next step is to start assembling the block so you can visually see how it's going to come together. So we'll put these guys on 4 corners, and I'll move them around like that. Then this one, top and bottom. And then this one right here. So this is what your 9-patch block is going to look like, and you're going to create 10 like this. Now when it comes to the sewing part of it, because we're working on a quilt and a quilt block here, we're going to use our 1/4 inch seam allowance. I tend to go a little bit narrower to make what we call a scant 1/4 inch, and so it's just a little bit narrower, maybe 1 or 2 threads of the fabric itself, smaller than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the way I like to piece my 9-patch blocks is to sew these 3, then these 3, and then these 3, and then I'll come back and put them together. So once these are into a little horizontal strips, right, sewn together, then I'll go and attach this top strip to the middle one, and then go back and attach the bottom one to here. And at the end of that, you'll have put together all 9 patchwork pieces here to create one 9-patch quilt block. Now, because I want to create 10 identical blocks, what I'm going to do is basically stack them all on top of each other. So if this is my foundation, I'm just going to put the same ones right on top of each other and basically create a stack that's 10 rows high of the exact same thing. So this is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I'll repeat that down here, and I'm just going to stack this up so I can take all the stacks with me to the sewing machine and crank these out more assembly line style. Now each one of these stacks is 10 squares high, and you'll notice that we have 4 left over of this because we've cut out 54 from those 6 strips, but we only need 50. So those extra ones, you can set them aside for now. Now that we have all these, we're basically going to build these blocks one on top of the other so that we can make the 10 identical blocks that we need for this quilt. We're at the sewing machine now, and I have my needle and thread ready to go. And what I brought over is just the top row of the 9-patch block. So I'm going to assemble all of these first. And then because they're all identical, I'm just going to continue to do the same thing. So what I typically do, now there are a lot of different ways for more efficient sewing, and I have a different technique that I often use. But because this quilt is very beginner friendly, rather than confuse you all even more by adding a different style of piecing these patchwork blocks together, we're going to keep it a little bit more simplified. So first, we can only sew one seam at a time. So I'm going to grab just these first 2 and set that aside. And I am just going to grab one from each of these and run it through here continuously. And this is called strip piecing. So I don't use pins or anything when I'm working with blocks that are this small. So I just visually place them the way they're supposed to be in the block, and then just turn one on top of the other so that the pretty sides of each one are touching. And I know that I'm going to sew right here using my 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. It doesn't really matter too much as long as you're consistent. The quilt may turn out a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger than I designed it to be, but as long as you're consistent, all your seams will be fine. Once I finish that first one, I leave it. I'm not going to stop and cut my threads or anything. I'm simply going to grab the next 2 and run them through here the same way, and continue to do it till I'm done with these 10. Once I'm done strip piecing that first row, I'm going to bring them all back, and then I'm going to attach one of these to the end of these two, right? To create 10 continuous rows. So I'm going to now cut my thread, bring all these guys up, and I don't bother to cut them yet, okay? I simply will come to the top one, open it up, and put this one where it needs to be for sewing it. So if this is here, this one in the center, and then the next one on the right side. So again, visually oriented the way it's supposed to be, and then put one on top of the other. Now when I get to the end, I'll cut my thread and then bring them all up, and you'll see that they're all kind of tied together, but they're 10 individual rows of blocks that are all going to be the top of each one of the 10 blocks that we're going to be making. So let's grab this and let me show you this handy little tool that I use to separate these out. All right, so now we're ready to press these, because remember, we sewed 2 seams and we haven't yet pressed them. So we want to press for sure before we start going and adding any more blocks to these strips. So to separate them into their own strips, you can just use scissors like this to separate each one and cut the threads in between them. Or I've also come across this handy little tool that basically is a little stand, plastic piece like that, and there's a blade in here. So you can grab your blocks and place them right in between, and the blade then cuts the thread for you. So just another option, and I always include links on where you can find the stuff I use, so keep that in mind. All right, so we've separated all these, but they all need to be pressed, because you can see all the seam allowances there, and it's quite bulky. So we're going to press these afterwards, though. Because we're going to repeat the process to the rest of the other 2 rows that we need to put together to create the 9 patch blocks, we're going to do the same thing that we just did to each of these, and then once they're all at this stage, then we'll go and press it. And so it's just a little bit more efficient way, and it's also summer here in Florida, so it will help me stay a little bit cooler in my studio since I don't yet have to turn on the iron. It's also helpful every step of the way to visually be walking yourself through the project. So these 10 rows are going to be the tops of my 9 patch block, and now I know I can just leave that there for now. I'm going to grab these 3 stacks and do the same thing that I did before. And now that I have all of the rows of all 10 blocks completed, now is when I get my little ironing board here and heat up my iron so that I can press all these seams at once. And it's just easier to do them now before you start sewing everything together. So typically you want to press to the dark. And the way that that's going to work in this specific block, because we're working with lights and darks, if this one I press the seam towards the dark, this row, when it's then connected to this row, the seams are going to perfectly abut, because the darks on this second row are this way. So if this seams are going this way, that means these ones will be going that way, and they'll nestle, it'll reduce bulk, and it'll make matching up the intersections of all the different rows super, super easily. So for this project, if you're working with lights and darks and my kinfolk fabric like this, make sure that when you press your seams, you're pressing them to the dark. Now that all the rows are pressed, we can grab some pins. I personally am not going to pin. Again, when I'm working with smaller projects, like smaller strips of fabric, I just tend to go straight to the sewing machine. But I'll show you how it goes. So this is the bottom, this is the middle row, and this is the top. So I'm going to go take all of this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew 2 at a time, similar to how we initially sewed like this piece to this piece. Now I'm going to treat each row the same way. So I'm going to grab this row and I'm going to sew it to this one. And so what you'll see is, let me grab one of each and show you. You see how this seam is going to the right and this one is going to the left? There's no two seams going in the same direction. Like this would create more bulk. But when it's like this, they really just like catch right there. And this one is going to catch right there. And I'll be able to sew this up super easily and without any pins. So let's grab this and head over to the sewing machine. Here I have the top and the second row, and then once these come together, I'll go back and grab the last one, but I'm going to grab 1 and 1. So this one, pretty sides touching, right? One right on top of the other. And if you were going to use pins, you would probably just put a couple pins here and here at the intersections. But because there are only 2 intersections per row that I'm connecting here, it's easy enough that I can control it. So I just nestle them there, and when I get closer to the other one, I'll adjust there as well. So now, the same way that we did it with the individual rows, I'm not going to press until I'm done with the block. Since I'm sitting here, I have them all connected, I might as well grab the third row. And we'll start at the top. And in this design, it's real simple to know where to sew this one. You don't want to sew it to another one just like it, because that's not the 9-patch block that we designed this quilt to be, right? Instead, it needs to go on the bottom side. So here. So I will just flip one on top of the other and run it through the machine the same way we've been doing them. Now that we've sewn all the blocks up, let's get our handy little cutter here and separate them all so we can press them all flat, and you're going to be done with 10 of your 9-patch blocks, which is basically half of your quilt. And now let's press these and check our points. And they all look pretty good to me. And once you're done pressing them flat, you have completed 10 of the 20 blocks for this quilt along. And there you have it. Super quick and easy ways to complete 10 of the blocks that you need for this quilt. So that's your homework. Go ahead and gather your fabrics if you don't yet have them. Prep your fabrics, cut your squares, and put these blocks together as we've covered so far in this quilt along. Then meet me back here next week where we're going to jump into cutting out the fabrics that we need for the second block that's featured in this quilt. Thanks again for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, hit it with the thumbs up below, share it with your friends on social media, and I will see you in the next video.